Imagine standing at the edge of 1985, watching two parallel stories about to unfold. In one timeline, the one we know, Steve Jobs leaves Apple in September after a brutal power struggle with CEO John Sculley. He takes 5 employees with him and founds NeXT Computer, pouring his vision into elegant black cube workstations that cost nearly $10,000. Meanwhile, Bill Gates pushes forward with Microsoft, releasing Windows 1.0 in November of that same year, a graphical interface built atop MS-DOS that most critics dismiss as clunky and unnecessary. These two paths would eventually lead Jobs back to Apple in 1997 and cement Gates as the dominant force in personal computing. But what if those paths had crossed? What if, in that pivotal year, Steve Jobs had walked into Microsoft's Redmond headquarters instead of founding NeXT, and Bill Gates had departed to create his own computer company after leaving Apple? The technology we use today, from our phones to our operating systems, exists because of decisions made by specific people at specific moments. Change those people, change those decisions, and the entire landscape transforms. This is not a story about better or worse. It is a story about different. A calm exploration of how the personalities, philosophies, and priorities of two brilliant minds could have reshaped the tools billions of people use every day. Let's walk through this alternate history together, examining each turn, each product launch, each cultural shift that might have emerged if Jobs and Gates had swapped their 1985 destinies. In our reality, September 1985 marked Steve Jobs' most painful professional moment. After recruiting John Sculley from PepsiCo with the famous line about wanting to sell sugar water versus changing the world, Jobs found himself outmaneuvered in Apple's boardroom. The Macintosh, despite its revolutionary graphical interface, was struggling in sales. It was too expensive, with limited software, competing against the IBM PC and its clones that dominated corporate America. Sculley and the board decided to remove Jobs from the Macintosh division, offering him a figurehead chairman role with no real power. Jobs tried to organize a coup, but the plan leaked. On September 16th, he submitted his resignation, taking with him Bud Tribble, George Crow, Rich Page, Susan Barnes, and Daniel Lewin. Together, they would form NeXT. Bill Gates, in that same autumn, was riding a very different trajectory. Microsoft had announced Windows in November 1983, promising it would ship by 1984. The deadline slipped to June 1985, then finally to November 20th of that year. The delay was so severe that industry observers began calling Windows vaporware, promotional software that never actually materializes. When Windows 1.0 finally arrived, it was underwhelming. The interface required a mouse, which most PC users didn't own. It couldn't overlap windows, they could only be tiled side by side. It was slow, limited, and clearly inferior to the Macintosh interface Apple had shipped a year earlier. Yet Gates remained committed. In interviews, he described Windows as Microsoft's future, the foundation upon which everything else would be built. His determination was absolute, even when the evidence suggested he was wrong. Now imagine these circumstances reversed. Picture Steve Jobs restless and frustrated after being pushed out of Apple, not starting a new computer company but instead being recruited by Microsoft. Perhaps he meets Gates at a conference, or perhaps Gates, recognizing Jobs' design genius and understanding of what consumers want, makes an offer Jobs can't refuse. Gates steps aside from day-to-day operations, maybe even sells his Microsoft shares, and decides to build his own computer company from scratch. This would be Gates's NeXT. What would each man do with his new domain? Steve Jobs walks into Microsoft's Redmond campus in early 1986. The company employs around 1,200 people, most of them engineers and programmers scattered across buildings that lack any cohesive architectural vision. The cafeteria serves functional food. The offices are beige and utilitarian. For Jobs, who obsessed over every detail of Apple's environment, this would be jarring. But more jarring still would be the culture. Microsoft in 1986 is a company built by and for coders. Meetings are confrontational, with engineers expected to defend their ideas against withering criticism. Hierarchy is loose. Anyone can challenge anyone if they have better logic. The focus is on shipping software that works, not software that delights. Beauty is not a priority. Market dominance is. Jobs' first instinct would be to change everything, but this is a different Jobs than the one who founded Apple in a garage. This is a Jobs who just lost a political battle, who watched his own board choose a CEO from the soft drink industry over him. This could imply he arrives at Microsoft slightly humbled, or at least more strategic. He would need to pick his battles. His initial focus would likely center on Windows, which is exactly where Microsoft needs help. Windows 1.0 is failing. Retailers are skeptical. Developers are ignoring it. Corporate buyers see no reason to switch from MS-DOS. Gates had bet the company's future on Windows, but the execution is not matching the vision. Jobs would immediately see what's wrong. Windows 1.0 is not a product designed from the user backward. It is an engineer's solution to a technical problem. How do we put a graphical layer on top of MS-DOS? The answer Microsoft's team produced was functional but joyless. Jobs would tear it apart. Not the concept is correct, but the implementation. He would push for overlapping windows, for smoother scrolling, for interface elements that feel natural to touch with a mouse. He would obsess over the default font, arguing that it needs to be readable and beautiful. He would demand that the mouse included with Windows computers be redesigned, that the cable be longer, that the buttons have a satisfying click. These would seem like trivial details to Microsoft's engineering culture, but Jobs would insist they matter. They matter because people notice them, even if they can't articulate why. More fundamentally, Jobs would likely delay the next version of Windows. He would recognize that shipping incremental improvements won't change the narrative. Windows needs a dramatic leap. Something that makes people reconsider their assumptions. Based on what we know about Jobs' approach at Apple, and later at NeXT, this could imply he would push for a complete visual redesign, a user interface so elegant and intuitive that even critics would have to acknowledge its superiority. This would take time, maybe 2 or 3 years instead of the rapid release cycle Microsoft had planned. There would be internal resistance. Developers would complain about the moving target. The sales team would worry about losing momentum. But Jobs would hold firm, arguing that one great product beats 5 mediocre ones. At the same time, Jobs would begin reshaping Microsoft's product strategy. In our timeline, Microsoft's strength was its pragmatism. The company would partner with anyone, support any hardware platform, license its software widely. This is what allowed MS-DOS to become ubiquitous. Jobs would find this approach philosophically problematic. He believed in end-to-end control, in the tight integration of hardware and software. This suggests he might push Microsoft toward creating its own computers, machines designed specifically to run Windows. This would be controversial, potentially alienating the PC manufacturers who were Microsoft's partners. But Jobs would argue that without a reference platform, without a machine that shows Windows at its best, the operating system would always be compromised by lowest common denominator hardware. Imagine then a Microsoft computer announced in 1988 or 1989. Not a clone, not a generic beige box, but a machine with distinctive design. Perhaps a sleek tower with clean lines, or an all-in-one design that anticipates the iMac by a decade. It would be expensive, certainly more expensive than typical PCs, but it would demonstrate what Windows could do when not held back by commodity components. This would create tension with Compaq Dell and other manufacturers, but Jobs would accept that tension as the price of having a vision. He would believe that showing the world what's possible matters more than maintaining everyone's comfort. Now turn to Bill Gates in this alternate timeline. He leaves Microsoft in 1986, maybe even earlier, and gathers a small team to create a new computer company. But this company would be nothing like Jobs' NeXT. Where Jobs built elegant black cubes and obsessed over the design of the optical drive, Gates would approach the problem with his characteristic pragmatism. What does the market actually need? What problems remain unsolved? Gates' NeXT, let's call it something else, perhaps Vertex Computer or Synthesis Systems, would focus on business applications, not universities, which was Jobs' original NeXT target market, but corporations. Gates understood corporate buyers better than anyone. He knew they cared about compatibility, support, total cost of ownership, and measurable productivity gains. They did not care about magnesium cases or perfect right angles. Based on what we know about Gates' decision-making process, this suggests he would design a workstation that prioritizes function. The operating system would be sophisticated, perhaps Unix-based like NeXT, because Gates respected technical excellence, but the hardware would be modular and upgradable. No proprietary optical drives, standard components that could be easily replaced. Gates would also think carefully about price. Jobs priced the NeXT computer at $9,999, which was far too high for most educational institutions, let alone businesses. Gates would likely target a price point around $5,000 or $6,000, premium but not prohibitive. He would argue to his team that you can't change the world if no one can afford your product. This philosophy would extend to the software ecosystem. Where Jobs was selective about which developers could create NeXT applications, Gates would welcome anyone. He would create generous developer tools, extensive documentation, and programs to support third-party software companies. His goal would be to build a platform, not just a product. Interestingly, Gates' company in this timeline might arrive at some of the same innovations as NeXT did in our reality. Tim Berners-Lee famously used a NeXT computer to create the World Wide Web because NeXT's development tools made it easier to build networked applications. Given Gates' understanding of networking and his interest in connectivity, this could imply his workstations would also emphasize network capabilities. Built-in Ethernet would be standard. The operating system would include robust networking protocols. Gates might even push for early internet integration, recognizing before most others that connected computers would be transformative. However, Gates would likely avoid one of NeXT's critical mistakes. Jobs was so committed to his vision that he was unwilling to compromise, even when the market clearly wasn't responding. NeXT sold only 50,000 computers over its entire hardware existence. Gates, facing similar sales challenges, would pivot faster. Maybe instead of abandoning hardware entirely, he would license the operating system to other manufacturers, turning his company into a software platform play. Or maybe he would shift focus to creating enterprise software tools, building on the operating system's strengths in networking and development. The key difference is adaptability. Gates built Microsoft by being willing to change direction when evidence demanded it. Jobs often preferred to push forward, believing the market would eventually see things his way. By the late 1980s, our alternate timeline would feature a fascinating inversion. Microsoft, now led by Steve Jobs, would be preparing to release a dramatically redesigned Windows. Let's call it Windows 3J, the J for Jobs. This version would be visually stunning, with carefully chosen color palettes, smooth animations, and interface metaphors that feel natural. It would require more powerful hardware than previous versions, frustrating some users and manufacturers, but it would also demonstrate what personal computing could be. Meanwhile, Gates' company would have developed its own advanced operating system, perhaps called Synthos or Vertex Step, designed primarily for networked business environments but with clear potential for broader use. The competition between these two systems would be intense but different in character from the Apple versus Microsoft battles of our timeline. Jobs' Windows would emphasize consumer appeal and ease of use, while Gates' system would emphasize power, flexibility, and enterprise features. Both would have passionate advocates. Technology magazines would run comparison articles trying to determine which approach is better, though the real answer would be that they serve different needs. Jobs would market Windows with carefully staged demonstrations, showing how beautiful and intuitive computing can be. Gates would market his system with case studies and return on investment calculations, proving to CFOs that his platform reduces IT costs. Where this becomes particularly interesting is in the development ecosystem. In our timeline, Windows succeeded in part because Microsoft cultivated a massive developer community, while Apple's Macintosh ecosystem remained more closed and curated. In this alternate timeline, Jobs might try to maintain tighter control over what software can run on Windows. He might introduce quality standards, rejecting applications that don't meet Microsoft's design guidelines. This could imply a smaller but higher quality software library, which would be a significant strategic risk. If corporate buyers need specific applications that aren't available for Windows because they didn't pass Jobs' aesthetic requirements, those buyers will choose other platforms. Gates, conversely, would throw his platform wide open. Any developer could create applications for Synthos. The development tools would be free or cheap. The approval process would be minimal. This would result in a more chaotic ecosystem with variable quality, but also with more innovation and faster growth. Niche applications that serve specific industries or use cases would flourish. Corporate IT departments would appreciate the flexibility to build custom internal tools. Over time, this openness could give Gates' platform significant advantages in certain markets, even if it never matches Windows in consumer appeal. The graphical user interface wars of this period would also play out differently. In our reality, Microsoft faced lawsuits from Apple over alleged copying of the Mac's look and feel. In this alternate timeline, Jobs is leading Microsoft, so he would bring his understanding of interface design from his Apple days. This suggests Windows 3J would borrow heavily from Macintosh concepts, overlapping windows, menu bars, drag and drop, but implemented with Jobs' refinement. Apple, now under different leadership after Jobs' departure, might still file suit, but the case would be weaker because Jobs himself is now at Microsoft. He could argue perhaps that these are his ideas to use wherever he chooses. The legal battles would be messy, but might not derail Windows development the way they complicated history in our timeline. One of the most profound changes in this alternate timeline would be cultural. Microsoft under Gates was famously intense, with long hours and aggressive internal competition. Bill meetings were notorious for Gates challenging every assumption, sometimes harshly. Apple under Jobs had its own intensity, but of a different flavor. Jobs could be cruel about design failures, but he also inspired deep loyalty through his vision and charisma. What happens when Jobs tries to import his cultural values into Microsoft? The transformation would be gradual and incomplete. Jobs would quickly realize he can't simply overlay Apple's culture onto Microsoft's existing structure. The companies are too different, the employees too set in their ways. But he could introduce certain elements: company-wide presentations showcasing new products, building anticipation and excitement, greater emphasis on industrial design, not just for hardware but for software interfaces and even internal tools, a focus on end-to-end experience rather than isolated features. Some Microsoft veterans would resist, seeing these changes as superficial distractions from the real work of writing code. Others would embrace the new direction, finding it energizing. Jobs would likely bring in outside talent, designers and marketers who understand consumer products. This would create tension with the engineering-focused staff, who might see these new hires as lacking technical credibility. There would be arguments in meetings, with one side pushing for cleaner interfaces and the other side arguing that functionality matters more than appearance. Jobs would have to mediate these conflicts, learning to build consensus in a way he never quite managed at Apple. Over time, this could imply a hybrid culture emerges, one that values both technical excellence and user experience, both rigorous logic and intuitive design. At Gates' company, the culture would be different but equally distinctive. Gates would foster an environment of intellectual honesty and rapid iteration. Ideas would be tested and discarded quickly if they didn't work. There would be less emphasis on vision and more on evidence. What do customers actually want? What does the data show? Gates would encourage healthy debate, expecting team members to challenge each other's assumptions. The company would be lean, with minimal hierarchy and few layers of management. Decisions would be made quickly based on analysis rather than intuition. This pragmatic culture would extend to hiring. Gates would recruit brilliant engineers and give them substantial autonomy. He would be less concerned with whether someone fits a particular mold and more concerned with whether they can solve hard problems. The result would be a diverse engineering team in terms of background and approach, united by intellectual rigor. The company's offices would be functional rather than beautiful, with resources directed toward research and development rather than amenities. Gates would believe that talented people don't need fancy perks, they need interesting problems and the freedom to pursue solutions. Over time, these cultural differences would shape how each company approaches innovation. Microsoft under Jobs would pursue breakthroughs in user experience, finding new ways to make technology feel natural and accessible. Gates' company would pursue breakthroughs in capability, building systems that can do things previously impossible. Both would be innovative but in different dimensions, and interestingly, both might struggle with the aspects of technology their leader finds less intuitive. Jobs might underinvest in enterprise features and back-end infrastructure, focusing too much on the front-end experience. Gates might create powerful systems that remain difficult for average users to navigate, losing market share to more accessible alternatives. The 1990s brought the rise of the Internet, which changed computing forever. In our timeline, both Microsoft and Apple initially underestimated the web's importance. Microsoft eventually pivoted hard, bundling Internet Explorer with Windows and engaging in the browser wars with Netscape. Apple struggled through the 1990s and only truly embraced the Internet after Jobs returned. How would this era unfold differently? Steve Jobs at Microsoft would recognize the Internet's potential, but perhaps not immediately. Jobs' strength was in understanding how technology could enhance individual creativity and expression. The Internet in its early form, text-based bulletin boards and FTP sites, wouldn't immediately trigger his design instincts. But once graphical web browsers like Mosaic appeared, Jobs would see the possibilities. This could imply that Microsoft under Jobs would invest heavily in creating not just a browser, but an entire web experience. The browser wouldn't just display pages, it would integrate seamlessly with the operating system, becoming part of how users interact with their computers. Jobs might push for innovations like visual bookmarking systems, web page design tools integrated directly into Windows, and seamless media playback. He would insist that browsing the web should feel as intuitive as using any other part of the operating system. Microsoft's browser in this timeline, perhaps called Navigator or Explorer, would be beautifully designed but also tightly controlled. Jobs might resist fully open web standards if they compromise his vision of how the web should look and function. This would create controversy in the developer community, where open standards are valued. But Jobs would argue that some degree of curation makes for a better user experience. The antitrust issues that plagued Microsoft in our timeline might still emerge in this alternate history, but in different form. In our reality, Microsoft was accused of using its operating system monopoly to unfairly push Internet Explorer. In this alternate timeline, the accusations might focus on Jobs' tight integration of web technologies into Windows, making it difficult for competing browsers to offer the same experience. The legal battles would be intense, potentially distracting Microsoft from product development. Jobs would be frustrated by regulators who don't understand that he's trying to make computing better, not trying to eliminate competition. The resolution might involve some compromises, forced separation between operating system and browser, but Jobs would resist every step. Bill Gates's approach to the Internet would be characteristically different. Gates wrote his famous Internet Tidal Wave memo in 1995, recognizing the web's transformative potential. In this alternate timeline, he would make similar realizations but with different conclusions. Rather than bundling a browser with an operating system, Gates might create standalone internet services and tools. His company could develop early cloud computing platforms, recognizing that networked applications represent the future. Based on his understanding of platforms and ecosystems, this suggests Gates would invest in server-side technologies and development frameworks that make it easier to build web applications. Gates' company might pioneer concepts like web services and distributed computing well before they became mainstream. The technical architecture would be sophisticated, perhaps even ahead of its time. However, the user-facing products might be less polished. Where Jobs creates beautiful browsers that average users love, Gates creates powerful back-end systems that developers love. Both approaches have merit, but they appeal to different constituencies. In the consumer market, Jobs' Windows would likely dominate. In the enterprise market, especially for companies building their own web applications, Gates' platforms would be preferred. The dot-com boom of the late 1990s would present interesting challenges for both men. Jobs, with his focus on consumer experience, might be tempted to launch Microsoft into e-commerce or digital media distribution early. Perhaps Microsoft would introduce an online music store years before iTunes, or an e-book platform before the Kindle. Jobs would see these as natural extensions of the computing experience. The execution would be elegant, but the timing might be ahead of market readiness. Bandwidth limitations and consumer habits in the late 1990s might make some of these initiatives premature. Gates, more cautious and data-driven, might resist jumping into every internet trend. He would focus his company's resources on infrastructure and tools, letting others build consumer services on top of his platforms. This would be a missed opportunity in some ways, as the dot-com boom created massive wealth for early movers. But it would also protect his company from some of the excesses and crashes that devastated many internet startups. When the bubble burst in 2000 and 2001, Gates' conservative approach would look prescient. The early 2000s brought the convergence of computing and telecommunications. Palm Pilots, Blackberries, and early smartphones began reshaping how people thought about portable technology. In our timeline, Microsoft invested heavily in Windows Mobile, while Apple initially stayed out of the phone market entirely until the iPhone in 2007. How would this play out if Jobs was leading Microsoft and Gates was running his own computer company? Steve Jobs would see mobile computing as the next frontier almost immediately. His experience with portable devices, even limited experience, would convince him that the future involves computers you carry everywhere. But Jobs wouldn't approach mobile the way Microsoft did in our timeline. He wouldn't try to shrink Windows down to fit a tiny screen with a stylus. Instead, he would insist on rethinking the entire interface paradigm. What makes sense on a mobile device? How do people want to interact with technology while walking, standing, waiting? Based on what we know about Jobs' design philosophy, this suggests he would push for touch interfaces, large screens, and simplified interactions. The challenge would be timing and technology. In the early 2000s, capacitive touchscreens capable of multi-touch were not yet mature. Battery technology was limited. Processors powerful enough to run sophisticated interfaces while sipping power didn't exist in phone-sized packages. Jobs might push his team to develop these technologies, or he might wait for the broader industry to solve these problems before entering the market. His impatience would battle with his perfectionism. Launch too early with compromised technology, and you damage the brand. Wait too long, and competitors establish the market. Imagine a Microsoft mobile device announced in 2004 or 2005. Not a phone, initially, but a pocket computer. It would have a large touch screen, perhaps 3 or 4 inches, enormous by the standards of the time. The interface would be built around icons and gestures, not menus and styluses. It would sync wirelessly with Windows computers, sharing contacts, calendars, and documents. The industrial design would be sleek, perhaps a smooth slab of glass and metal. Critics would call it too expensive and too different from existing devices. Corporate buyers would hesitate, preferring Blackberries with physical keyboards. But certain users, especially creative professionals and early adopters, would be captivated. Jobs would market this device not as a phone or a PDA, but as a new category. Personal computing has moved beyond desks and laps. It now fits in your pocket. The advertising would show the device in beautiful environments, being used for creative tasks, photography, music, design. The message would be aspirational. This is a tool for people who want to create, not just consume. Initial sales would be modest, maybe a few 100,000 units in the first year. But the reviews would be rapturous among tech enthusiasts, and the device would create buzz and anticipation for what comes next. Then, as telecommunications technology improved and partnerships became possible, Jobs would push Microsoft into the phone market. But it wouldn't be a smartphone that tries to do everything. Jobs would strip away features ruthlessly, focusing on a few core experiences. Phone calls, of course, but also web browsing, email, and media playback. The first Microsoft phone, perhaps called the Phone, with characteristic Jobs simplicity, or maybe Cortana years before that name was used for anything else, would launch around 2006 or 2007, roughly contemporaneous with the iPhone in our timeline. This phone would revolutionize the industry just as the iPhone did, though perhaps in slightly different ways. Jobs would insist on a beautiful screen, responsive touch interface, and seamless integration with Windows. The app ecosystem will be curated with Microsoft approving each application to ensure quality. This would frustrate some developers who preferred open platforms, but it would also create a reputation for polish and reliability. The phone would be expensive, positioned as premium, but it would create a new category and shift consumer expectations about what phones should be. Bill Gates's approach to mobile would be characteristically different. Gates recognized the importance of mobile computing early, even in our timeline. His famous tablet PC initiative in the early 2000s, while ahead of its time, showed his understanding that portable computing mattered. In this alternate timeline, without the constraints of Microsoft's existing Windows architecture and partner relationships, Gates would have more freedom to innovate. Gates might pursue mobile through a partnership strategy. Rather than building phones himself, he could license his operating system to device manufacturers, much like Android would later do. His pitch would be compelling. We provide sophisticated software optimized for mobile. You build the hardware and handle distribution. This would allow rapid market penetration, with multiple manufacturers producing devices at various price points. The trade-off would be fragmentation. Different devices would have different capabilities, different screen sizes, different performance. The user experience would be inconsistent. Alternatively, Gates might focus on enterprise mobile solutions. BlackBerry dominated corporate email in the early 2000s because IT departments trusted its security and management tools. Gates could build devices and software specifically for business users, prioritizing email, calendar, document editing, and secure communication. These devices wouldn't be beautiful, they would be functional. They would have physical keyboards because typing long emails on touchscreens was difficult with early technology. They would have long battery life, even if that meant thicker form factors. Corporate buyers would appreciate the pragmatism. Where this becomes particularly interesting is in the application ecosystem. If Gates licenses his mobile operating system widely, he would attract developer interest quickly. The lower barriers to entry compared to Jobs' curated approach would mean more applications covering more niche use cases. However, quality would be variable. Some apps would be excellent, others would be buggy or poorly designed. Gates would address this through marketplace ratings and reviews, letting users self-select quality rather than imposing top-down curation. By the late 2000s, the mobile landscape in this alternate timeline would look quite different from our reality. Jobs' Microsoft would have a premium smartphone with fanatical fans, beautiful design, and a carefully curated app ecosystem. Market share would be respectable but not dominant, perhaps 20 or 30% of the smartphone market. Gates' platform would have broader reach but more fragmentation, available on devices from multiple manufacturers at various price points. Together, these two approaches would define the market, with other competitors struggling to differentiate. In our timeline, Apple's expansion into consumer electronics, the iPod, iPhone, iPad, and Apple Watch transformed the company and the industry. Microsoft attempted similar moves with the Zune, Windows Phone, and Surface tablets, with mixed results. How would this play out with Jobs at Microsoft and Gates running his own company? Steve Jobs' intuition about consumer electronics would guide Microsoft into new markets earlier and more successfully than our timeline. The iPod launched in 2001, capitalizing on the intersection of portable storage, digital music, and design. Jobs at Microsoft would likely pursue something similar, recognizing that music distribution was changing and people wanted their entire libraries portable. But the Microsoft version might be different in execution. Jobs would insist on end-to-end control, not just the device, but also the music store and the desktop software. This would mean Microsoft launching its own music download service, perhaps partnering with record labels to offer legal downloads before piracy became rampant. The device itself would be beautifully designed, with a simple interface and intuitive controls. Perhaps instead of the click wheel, Jobs would push for an early touchscreen interface, or maybe a gesture-based control scheme. The integration with Windows would be seamless, with automatic syncing and playlist management. The marketing would be iconic. Clean white ads showing the device with colourful headphones, or silhouettes of people dancing, music as expression and identity. The product would be positioned as premium, not the cheapest option, but the best one. Initial sales might be slower than the iPods because Microsoft's brand was associated with computers, not cool consumer electronics. But over time, great design and word of mouth would build momentum. By the mid-2000s, this Microsoft music player, maybe called Groove or Rhythm, would be a cultural phenomenon. Jobs would then leverage that success into other consumer electronics. Tablets would be an obvious target. In our timeline, Microsoft pushed tablets in the early 2000s with stylus-based devices that ran full Windows. Jobs would see that as wrong. A tablet shouldn't be a computer with the keyboard removed, it should be something new. Based on his understanding of touch interfaces and media consumption, this implies Jobs would create a tablet focused on content consumption, reading, watching, browsing, with a beautiful screen and an interface built around gestures. This Microsoft tablet, launched perhaps in 2008 or 2009, would be thin, light, with a large high-resolution display. It wouldn't run full Windows, instead running a modified version optimized for touch. Critics would complain that it can't replace a laptop, missing the point that it's not trying to. It's a different device for different use cases. The app ecosystem would be crucial, and Jobs would work to ensure that publishers and content creators embrace the platform. Digital magazines, newspapers, books, and video would all be available. The device would be positioned as the future of media. Bill Gates's approach to consumer electronics would be more measured. Gates always had healthy respect for the consumer market's difficulty. Building products people love requires different skills than building products businesses need. In this alternate timeline, Gates might avoid consumer electronics initially, focusing his company on enterprise solutions and development tools. But as the market evolved and consumer devices became more powerful, Gates might see opportunities. Gates could approach consumer electronics through the lens of productivity. What devices help people get work done? A tablet that's great for reading and editing documents, for sketching and note-taking, for collaboration. The device would have a keyboard option, maybe a detachable one, anticipating the Surface design from our timeline. It would support stylus input for precise work. The marketing would emphasize versatility, one device for entertainment and productivity. Gates might also invest in gaming, recognizing it as a massive consumer market with technical challenges his company could solve. In our timeline, Microsoft launched the Xbox in 2001, competing with Sony and Nintendo. In this alternate timeline, Gates' company might create a gaming platform, but with different priorities. Rather than focusing on exclusive titles and console hardware, Gates might build a gaming service that works across devices. Play games on your computer, your tablet, your television. The technology would be sophisticated with cloud streaming before it was common, but the user experience might be clunky initially. Where Gates and Jobs would differ most sharply is in product philosophy. Jobs believed in creating a few products and making them perfect. Microsoft under Jobs would have a relatively narrow product line, each product polished and distinctive. Gates believed in platforms and ecosystems, building technology that others could use to create value. His consumer electronics would be more open, more modular, more focused on enabling rather than dictating. Neither approach is wrong. They serve different values and attract different users. By 2010, the consumer electronics landscape would be split between Jobs' integrated, beautiful, carefully controlled Microsoft devices and Gates' more open, versatile, productivity-focused offerings. Both would have passionate fan bases. Technology debates would rage online about which philosophy is better, and notably, both approaches would push the industry forward, forcing competitors to improve design, functionality, and user experience. Software platforms live or die by their developer communities. The most successful platforms in technology history, Windows, iOS, Android, succeeded because they attracted thousands of developers building millions of applications. How would developer relations evolve in this alternate timeline? Steve Jobs at Microsoft would bring his complicated relationship with developers. On one hand, Jobs understood that great applications make platforms valuable. On the other hand, he wanted control over quality and user experience. This tension defined Apple's approach to third-party developers throughout Jobs' tenure. At Microsoft, Jobs would likely implement stricter guidelines for Windows applications than existed in our timeline. Imagine Microsoft under Jobs creating an application certification program. Developers could still write Windows software, but to receive Microsoft's seal of approval, to be featured in Microsoft's App Store, applications would need to meet design standards, consistent interface elements, responsive performance, proper integration with system features. Jobs would argue this improves the overall Windows experience, preventing the bloatware and inconsistent interfaces that plagued PCs in our reality. Developers would grumble that Microsoft is being too controlling, but many would comply because certification would drive sales. This approach would create a split ecosystem. Certified applications would be polished and consistent, but perhaps more expensive and less experimental. Uncertified applications would be wilder, more diverse, sometimes brilliant and sometimes awful. Power users would appreciate having choices. Casual users might stick primarily to certified apps, trusting Microsoft's curation. Over time, this could imply Windows applications would generally be higher quality than in our timeline, but there might be fewer of them, especially in niche categories. Jobs would also invest heavily in developer tools, but in characteristic fashion these tools would be opinionated. There would be a recommended way to build Windows applications, with frameworks and libraries that encourage certain patterns. Developers who followed these patterns would find development relatively easy. Those who wanted to do something unconventional would face more friction. Microsoft's developer conferences would feature beautifully staged presentations showing new capabilities, with Jobs himself often demonstrating features. The emphasis would be on empowering developers to create amazing user experiences, not just functional software. Bill Gates' approach to developers would be radically different. Gates came from programming. He understood developers at a deep level. His company's developer relations will be built on providing excellent tools, comprehensive documentation, and freedom to innovate. The development environment would be sophisticated but flexible, supporting multiple programming languages, multiple frameworks, and multiple approaches. Gates would likely make developer tools free or very cheap, removing barriers to entry. He would invest in education, creating resources that help programmers learn to build for his platform. The company's developer conferences would be technical and deep, with sessions covering architecture, optimization, and advanced techniques. Gates might present himself, but the focus would be on content, not spectacle. Developers would appreciate the respect for their craft and intelligence. The result would be an explosion of applications for Gates' platform. Because the barriers to entry are low and the tools are powerful, everyone from hobbyists to large software companies would build for the ecosystem. The quality would vary enormously, but the sheer quantity would mean that almost any use case would be covered. Enterprise developers in particular would flock to the platform, appreciating the flexibility and power. By the 2000s, software development in this alternate timeline would look distinctly different. Microsoft under Jobs would have a curated ecosystem of high-quality applications with strong design consistency and user experience. Gates's platform would have a vast, chaotic ecosystem with something for everyone. Each approach would have advantages. Microsoft would be better for casual users who value simplicity and polish. Gates's platform would be better for power users and businesses with specific needs. Interestingly, both platforms would influence the broader industry. Competitors would learn from Jobs' curation approach, implementing their own quality standards. They would also learn from Gates' developer-friendly approach, recognizing that attracting developers requires removing barriers. The synthesis of these two philosophies might appear in third-party platforms that try to balance openness with quality, learning from both Jobs and Gates. How companies make money shapes what they build and how they behave. Microsoft in our timeline made most of its money from Windows and Office licenses. Apple under Jobs shifted from hardware sales to a combination of hardware, software, and services. How would business models evolve in this alternate timeline? Steve Jobs at Microsoft would fundamentally question the licensing model. In our reality, Microsoft licensed Windows to PC manufacturers who installed it on their machines. This created broad adoption, but also gave Microsoft limited control over the end-user experience. Jobs, believing in integration, would likely push for a different model. What if Microsoft sold computers directly to consumers, with Windows included but not separately licensed? This would represent a massive strategic shift. Microsoft's PC partners, Compaq, Dell, HP, would be furious. They would threaten to switch to alternative operating systems or sue for anti-competitive behavior. Jobs would have to navigate these conflicts carefully, perhaps maintaining the licensing model for enterprise customers while building direct-to-consumer business for premium products. It would be messy and politically complex, but Jobs would believe it's necessary to create the best products. Jobs would also diversify Microsoft's revenue streams. Digital media sales, music, movies, books would become significant businesses. Application sales through Microsoft's curated App Store would generate revenue and lock in customers. Subscription services for cloud storage, software updates, and premium features would create recurring revenue. Microsoft under Jobs would look more like a consumer technology company than a software licensing company, which would require new capabilities in retail, logistics, and customer service. The financial implications would be significant. Licensing Windows generated enormous margins because the cost of producing additional copies was essentially zero. Selling hardware involves manufacturing costs, inventory risk, and supply chain complexity. Microsoft's profit margins might compress, at least initially, but the trade-off would be greater control and stronger brand loyalty. Over time, if Jobs successfully built Microsoft into a beloved consumer, brand premium pricing could restore healthy margins. Bill Gates would approach business models with his characteristic pragmatism. What model best serves the long-term success of the platform? Gates understood that platforms become valuable through network effects. The more users, the more developers, the more applications, the more users. This suggests he would prioritize adoption over short-term revenue maximization. Gates might offer his operating system at very low cost, or even free to hardware manufacturers, making money instead through services, support contracts, and enterprise licensing. The goal would be ubiquity. If everyone is using the platform, developers will target it, and the ecosystem becomes self-sustaining. This is similar to the approach Android would later take, though Gates would retain more control over the core platform than Google did with Android. For enterprise customers, Gates would build a different business model. Comprehensive support, contracts, training services, custom development, these would be high-margin businesses that also deepen customer relationships. Large corporations would pay significant fees for the security and reliability his platform provides, along with dedicated support. This enterprise focus would be less glamorous than consumer products, but potentially more profitable and definitely more stable. Gates would also invest in cloud computing earlier than most. Recognizing that networked applications represent the future, he would build data centers and cloud platforms that developers can use to build and host their applications. This infrastructure business would require massive capital investment, but would create a recurring revenue stream and strategic advantage. By the late 2000s, Gates's company might be a leader in cloud services, providing the backbone for internet companies. The contrast between Jobs' consumer-focused, high-margin, vertically integrated model and Gates' platform-focused, scale-driven, service-oriented model would define business strategy discussions throughout the industry. Neither is obviously superior. They optimize for different outcomes. Jobs prioritizes customer experience and brand value. Gates prioritizes market reach and ecosystem strength. Both can be successful if executed well. Now imagine arriving in this alternate 2026. What does the technology we use every day look like when these two visionaries swapped places 41 years ago? The differences would be profound, touching everything from the computers on our desks to the phones in our pockets to the way we think about technology itself. Your computer, if you're using a Microsoft device in this timeline, would be beautiful. The hardware design would be minimal and elegant, perhaps a thin all-in-one display with a wireless keyboard and mouse. The operating system would have a refined visual language, with smooth animations, carefully chosen fonts, and interface elements that feel natural. The default applications, mail, calendar, web browser, would all share a consistent design philosophy. Using the computer would feel cohesive and intentional, every detail considered. However, you might find certain limitations frustrating. Want to customize the interface beyond what Microsoft allows? That's difficult. Need a specialized application for a niche use case? It might not exist in Microsoft's curated App Store. Want to build your own computer with components you choose? Microsoft's tight integration of hardware and software makes that challenging. The trade-off for beauty and coherence is reduced flexibility. If you're using a device running Gates' operating system in this timeline, your experience would be quite different. The interface might be less immediately impressive, more utilitarian, but the power would be evident quickly. You could customize nearly everything, rearrange elements, change behaviors, install applications from anywhere. The system would be rock-solid stable, built on Unix foundations with decades of refinement. Performance would be excellent, optimized for efficiency. Your smartphone in this alternate timeline would reflect similar differences. The Microsoft phone would be sleek and intuitive, with a carefully curated app ecosystem. The camera would take stunning photos, with software processing that makes images look great without requiring technical knowledge. The device would work seamlessly with your Microsoft computer, syncing messages, photos, and documents automatically. But it would be expensive, and certain features would be locked down. Want to install an app that Microsoft hasn't approved? Not possible without jailbreaking, which would void your warranty. A phone running Gates' operating system would offer more choice. Multiple manufacturers would produce devices at various price points, from budget options to premium flagships. The app ecosystem would be vast and chaotic, with apps for every conceivable purpose. Some would be brilliant, others would be junk. You would have freedom to customize your home screen, install alternative app stores, and tinker with system settings. The trade-off would be inconsistency. Your phone might behave differently than your friend's phone running the same OS on different hardware. Tablets in this timeline would be mature and ubiquitous. Microsoft tablets would be premium media consumption devices, perfect for reading, watching, and casual browsing. The screen quality would be exceptional, the industrial design beautiful, the software optimized for touch. But productivity tasks might be limited. Gates tablets would be more versatile, with keyboard options and stylus support, capable of replacing laptops for many use cases. They would be positioned as productivity tools first, entertainment devices second. The broader technology industry would look different as well. In our reality, Apple's success under Jobs' return inspired countless competitors to prioritize design and user experience. In this alternate timeline, Microsoft under Jobs would have the same effect. Every technology company would invest in industrial design, hire user experience teams, and obsess over detail. The general quality of consumer technology would be higher, with fewer poorly designed products making it to market. Conversely, Gates' emphasis on platforms and ecosystems would influence the industry's structure. More companies would focus on building infrastructure that others use, rather than end-user products. The cloud computing industry would be more mature, with sophisticated platforms for building and deploying applications. Open-source development would be thriving, as Gates' company actively supported community-driven projects that strengthen the ecosystem. The competitive dynamics would be fascinating. Microsoft under Jobs and Gates' company would be the two giants, but they wouldn't be fighting over the same territory. Microsoft would dominate consumer computing and premium mobile devices. Gates' company would lead in enterprise solutions, cloud services, and development tools. Their revenues might be similar, but their businesses would be quite different. Other companies would have to choose which ecosystem to bet on, or somehow serve both. Innovation would flourish in different areas. Under Jobs' influence, consumer-facing innovation would accelerate. New interface paradigms, new categories of devices, new ways of interacting with technology. The focus would be on making technology more accessible and more delightful. Under Gates' influence, infrastructure innovation would accelerate. Faster networks, more efficient data centers, better development tools, more powerful cloud services. The focus would be on enabling others to build amazing things. Interestingly, some innovations from our timeline might never happen, while others might arrive earlier. Wearable technology like smartwatches might appear sooner if Jobs is at Microsoft, as he would see them as a natural extension of personal computing. Or they might appear later if he's skeptical of adding yet another screen to people's lives. Artificial intelligence and machine learning might advance faster if Gates' company invests heavily in cloud computing infrastructure that supports large-scale data processing. Or they might develop differently if the focus is on local processing rather than cloud-based AI. Privacy and security would be ongoing tensions. Jobs at Microsoft would prioritize user privacy, arguing that people's data should be protected and that Microsoft shouldn't abuse the access it has. But his desire for seamless experiences might lead to collecting data anyway, just with promises not to misuse it. Gates would approach privacy more technically, building encryption and security features into his platforms. But the open nature of his ecosystem might make enforcement difficult, with third-party apps potentially violating users' privacy. The relationship between technology companies and government would be complex. Microsoft under Jobs would be a powerful consumer brand, possibly more powerful than Apple ever became because it starts from Microsoft's dominant position. This would attract regulatory scrutiny. Jobs would chafe at regulation, believing that bureaucrats don't understand technology. Gates would be more willing to engage with government, explaining technical realities and finding pragmatic compromises. Both would face antitrust investigations, but they would navigate them differently. Looking at the software landscape, the applications we use daily would be different in subtle ways. If Jobs is curating Microsoft's ecosystem, the default apps for email, web browsing, and productivity would be exceptionally well designed but perhaps limited in advanced features. Power users might feel constrained, wanting more options and control. If Gates is building platforms, the default apps might be more functional than beautiful, but the ecosystem would include countless alternatives catering to every preference and workflow. The internet itself might look different. If Jobs influences how Microsoft approaches web technologies, we might have richer multimedia experiences and more proprietary technologies. If Gates influences web standards through his cloud platforms, we might have more open protocols and better interoperability. The tension between beautiful, controlled experiences and open, flexible systems would play out in web development just as it does in operating systems. Social media, which emerged in the 2000s, would develop in this context. The platforms might be influenced by the dominant technology philosophies. In a world where Jobs has shaped consumer technology expectations, social media companies might focus more on design and user experience, creating visually appealing, carefully controlled environments. In a world where Gates has shaped platform thinking, social media might be more open and interoperable, with users able to move between platforms more easily. The economics of technology would be different too. In our timeline, Apple became the world's most valuable company by selling premium hardware and ecosystem lock-in. Microsoft remained enormously profitable through software licensing and cloud services. In this alternate timeline, Microsoft under Jobs might be even more valuable if it successfully combines premium hardware with software and services. Gates' company might be less valuable in market capitalization, but more influential in terms of the infrastructure underlying the internet. Employment in the technology industry would be affected by these different approaches. Microsoft under Jobs would employ tens of thousands in design, marketing, retail and manufacturing, in addition to software engineering. The culture would be demanding but inspiring for those who thrive in design-driven environments. Gates's company would employ fewer people total, but more of them would be highly technical, working on complex platform problems. The culture would be intellectually rigorous, rewarding analytical thinking and problem-solving. The educational technology market would be shaped by these companies. Both Jobs and Gates cared about education, but they would approach it differently. Jobs might create beautiful educational devices and software, trying to make learning delightful. Gates might focus on building platforms that teachers and schools can use to create customized learning experiences. Both would have positive impacts, but they would serve different needs within the education system. What can we learn from imagining this alternate history? Not that one path is better than another. Both Jobs and Gates were extraordinary in different ways, but rather that individual choices and personalities matter enormously in shaping technology's evolution. If Steve Jobs had gone to Microsoft instead of founding NeXT, he would have brought his design sensibility, his user-focused philosophy, and his uncompromising standards to the dominant platform in personal computing. Windows would be more beautiful, more coherent, more focused on consumer delight. The trade-offs would be less flexibility and more control, but millions of users might appreciate the polish. Microsoft would become a consumer technology powerhouse earlier, competing more directly with consumer electronics companies. The company's influence on design across the industry would be profound. If Bill Gates had left Microsoft to start his own computer company, he would have built something quite different from NeXT. Where Jobs created beautiful but expensive workstations that struggled commercially, Gates would create pragmatic, powerful systems that solved real business problems. His platform approach and developer-friendly policies would attract a large ecosystem. His focus on infrastructure and services would position the company perfectly for the cloud computing era. The company might not be as culturally influential as Apple under Jobs, but it would be financially successful and technically respected. The tension between these two philosophies, beauty versus functionality, control versus openness, consumer delight versus developer freedom, is not resolved by choosing one over the other. Both have merit. Both serve important values. What this alternate history reveals is that technology is not deterministic. The tools we use, the interfaces we interact with, the ecosystems we buy into, all of these are shaped by human choices. In our reality, Jobs returned to Apple in 1997 and led one of the greatest corporate turnarounds in history. The iMac, iPod, iPhone, and iPad transformed Apple into the world's most valuable company and redefined multiple industries. Gates led Microsoft to dominance in personal computing and later transitioned to philanthropy, using his wealth to tackle global health challenges. Both men achieved extraordinary things on their actual paths. But imagining the swap reveals something important about how innovation happens. It's not just about technology or market conditions, it's about people with visions, fighting to realize those visions against resistance and inertia. Jobs and Gates had different visions, but both were compelling. Both could have succeeded in different circumstances. The world we actually got reflects one set of choices, but other worlds were possible. Perhaps the deepest lesson is about trade-offs. Every choice forecloses other options. When you optimize for beauty and coherence, you sacrifice flexibility and openness. When you optimize for developer freedom and platform reach, you sacrifice consistent user experience. Neither approach is wrong, they're different. The best outcome might involve learning from both, finding ways to balance competing values rather than choosing one exclusively. In this alternate timeline, technology users would have genuine choices between fundamentally different philosophies, both well executed. Want a beautiful, cohesive experience? Choose Microsoft under Jobs. Want power, flexibility, and openness? Choose Gates' platform. The competition between these approaches would drive both forward, each improving to address the other's strengths. What about the innovations that might be lost in this alternate timeline? If Jobs never returns to Apple, does the iPhone still get invented? Maybe, but perhaps not in the same form or at the same time. If Gates leaves Microsoft, does Windows ever become as dominant? Possibly, but the path would be different. The technologies we take for granted today often emerge from specific combinations of people, circumstances, and timing. Change any element, and the outcome changes. Yet certain pressures would remain regardless of who was leading which company. Consumer demand for better, faster, more capable devices. business needs for reliable, secure systems, developer desires for powerful tools and platforms. These forces would drive innovation whoever was in charge. Jobs and Gates would channel these forces differently, but both would respond to them. There's something poignant about this thought experiment. Both men are gone now. Steve Jobs passed away in 2011 after a long battle with cancer. He was only 56, cut off in what might have been the most productive phase of his career. Bill Gates has transitioned from technology to philanthropy, working to solve problems of disease, poverty, and education. Imagining them in swapped roles reminds us that history could have unfolded differently, that the specific talents and obsessions of individuals matter. It also reminds us that genius comes in many forms. Jobs' genius was aesthetic and experiential, understanding what people would love before they knew they wanted it. Gates' genius was analytical and strategic, seeing how systems fit together and building platforms for others to use. Neither form of genius is superior, they're complementary. The technology industry benefits from having both kinds of thinkers. As we close this alternate history, we might ask what it means for today's technology leaders. The choices being made now by people leading companies like Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and others will shape the technology landscape for decades. Should they prioritize user experience or user freedom? Should they build integrated ecosystems or open platforms? Should they focus on consumer delight or developer empowerment? There are no easy answers, only trade-offs. What we can say with confidence is that these choices matter. The decisions made by a few people in positions of power ripple out to affect billions of users. Understanding the different philosophies, the Jobs approach and the Gates approach, helps us think more clearly about what we want from technology. Do we want beautiful devices that just work, even if that means less control? Or do we want powerful tools we can customize, even if that means more complexity? Different people will answer differently, and that's okay. The world we actually inhabit, where Jobs returned to Apple and Gates built Microsoft into a software giant, has given us remarkable technology. Smartphones that are computers in our pockets, cloud services that store our lives, apps that help us work, play, learn, and connect. But it's useful to remember that this world was not inevitable. Other paths existed, other choices could have been made, other technologies could have emerged. In the alternate timeline we've explored, Steve Jobs at Microsoft and Bill Gates at his own company would have created a different but equally fascinating technology landscape. The computers would be different, the phones would be different, the software ecosystems would be different. Some things would be better, some would be worse, many would just be different, and that's the point. Technology is not a force of nature following fixed laws. It's a human creation, shaped by human values, human choices, human vision. So as you use your devices today, whatever they are, take a moment to appreciate the choices that created them. Someone decided how this button should work, how this screen should look, how this feature should behave. Those decisions accumulated over decades, built on choices made by thousands of people, but influenced deeply by a few visionary leaders. In our world, those leaders followed certain paths. In alternate worlds, they might have followed others. The technology would be different, but the human needs being served would be the same. What if Steve Jobs and Bill Gates had traded places in 1985? We've spent this journey exploring one answer to that question, imagining how their different philosophies would have shaped Microsoft and a new computer company. The details we've explored are speculative, based on what we know about these men's values and approaches, but the broader lesson is real. Individual vision matters, Personal philosophy shapes products. Different leaders create different futures. In our timeline, Jobs and Gates both succeeded extraordinarily, each in his own way. Jobs created beloved products that changed how we interact with technology. Gates built platforms that enabled countless others to create value. Both approaches were valid. Both were needed. The technology ecosystem is richer for having had both. If they had swapped places, they likely would have succeeded in different ways, bringing their individual talents to different challenges. Jobs would have made Microsoft's products more beautiful and its brand more beloved. Gates would have built sophisticated platforms and enabled a thriving ecosystem around his company. The world would be different, but it would still have benefited from their contributions. And so we return to 2026, to our actual reality, with its iPhones and Windows PCs, its Microsoft Office and MacBooks, its cloud services and app stores. This is the world we got, shaped by the choices that were actually made, the companies that were actually built, the leaders who actually led. It's not the only world that could have existed, but it's ours. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine those alternate paths, those other choices, those different technologies, not to regret what wasn't, but to appreciate what is, and to remember that the future is still being written, that new choices are being made every day, that the technology of tomorrow is being shaped right now by people making decisions about what matters and what doesn't. The story of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, whether in our reality or in alternate timelines, reminds us that individuals can change the world. Not alone, they both built teams and relied on countless others, but their vision, their drive, their specific talents made a difference. What they built reflects who they were, and what might have been reflects who they might have become in different circumstances. Thank you for joining this exploration of what might have been. As you rest, let these ideas settle. Think about the technology around you, the choices embedded in it, the people who made those choices. Dream about other possibilities, other worlds, other paths. And when you wake, you'll return to this reality, this timeline, this world shaped by the actual choices of actual people. It's a remarkable world, full of remarkable technology, even if it's not the only world that could have existed. Sleep well, dream of alternate histories, and wake ready to shape the one future that still lies ahead.